Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1067th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the privilege and pleasure of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Bruce Pearson, Chris Martin, John O'Connor, Ken Weathersby, and Amanda Millet-Sorsa. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. Working from a heterogeneous array of cultural traditions, Chris Martin makes paintings that serve as living documents of the eternal present. Chris Martin has been the subject of solo exhibitions at institutions worldwide, and his paintings are included in many permanent collections. John J. O'Connor is an American artist primarily known for his large-scale, labor-intensive abstract works on paper. In these works, O'Connor transforms information through idiosyncratic processes, creating equally idiosyncratic abstract shapes, forms, and patterns. He co-chairs visual arts at Sarah Lawrence College and is a member of the experimental art and technology collective Non-Core Projector. Bruce Pearson makes distinctive and hypnotic works that push the limits of painting. Constructed on Styrofoam panels, his paintings are fields of sensuous color and intricately creviced surfaces with visceral impact and optical effects. His seamlessly constructed, intricately layered images are often unique investigations in which text is the basis of image and image reverberates with meaning. Ken Weathersby is a contemporary visual artist known for his innovative approach to abstract painting. Weathersby's works are characterized by their intricate structures and the incorporation of unconventional materials. His art often features canvases with elements removed or rearranged, creating a unique interplay of depth and surface and allowing a collision of images, texts, and real space with abstraction. And our host today, Amanda Millet-Sorsa, is an artist, arts writer, and arts worker based in New York, where she is an active participant in the arts community. She's exhibited at Below Grand Gallery, the Unoppressive Non-Imperialist Bargain Bookstore, Shim Art Network, the Socrates Sculpture Park, and elsewhere. We are very lucky to have Amanda as a contributor to the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Amanda to get us started.
Thank you, Chloe. And thank you to the Brooklyn Rail for inviting me today. It's always a pleasure to be a host in these
Victoria Myers
lunchtime discussions. And thank you to all the artists for participating, not only in the show, but the ones also here present listening in and the ones taking part in today's discussion. I thought to begin with a brief summary of Alfred Jensen and his work, who has been a seminal artist for his time. He was a contemporary of the abstract expressionists in New York, and one of his closest friends was Mark Rothko, with whom he had affinities with. Jensen was born in Guatemala and educated in Europe, and he traveled extensively to experience and see different cultures and took personal interest in studying ancient cultures and civilizations. Eventually, he settled in New York and started making the work that we know from him today at age 50. His work was hugely influential to artists that came after him, like Donald Judd, Alan Capro, and Jasper Johns, among many others. He was known for painting also in very thick impasto with colors that came straight from the tube, and often referred to Goethe's theory of colors as a reference point and drew knowledge from the ancient civilizations that he loved studying, like mathematical theorems that came from ancient Greece to the Mayan calendar in Central America. The Apex is Nothing is the title of the show, and it's also the title of one of his paintings. And in the painting, we can see a division of 4 rectangles and 4 distinct colors, and using Mayan numbering system in the smaller rectangles. If we can see that painting, that would be great. As well as here, we can see some of the exhibition views of the show. The Pythagoras theorem, which is also the work that we actually have on view in the gallery, is a much larger work. It's almost at mural scale. And it gives us these repeated checkerboards and chessboards and pentagrams, rectangles, circles, triangles that are repeated in different scales. And a lot of his a lot of his work is so thick that it feels like the mortar layered in between bricks. His work is the starting point of this show, and it feels like it unites the work of the artist chosen to be a part of the show, which also explores systems, numbers, codes, and rules, and charts and grids, which become the structure or premise of the work. And so I thought that we could begin some of this discussion by hearing from the two curators, Ken and John, by having you both speak about what it is about Alfred Jensen's work that has been so significant for you and that became the premise for bringing this work together in this show.
Ken, do you want to go first, maybe?
Okay, I can jump in on that. I've been looking at Jensen for many years. When I was a student in Mississippi, I stumbled upon a catalog from one of his earliest retrospectives with no preparation for that, and really became fascinated with the work and have looked at it over the years. There's a kind of a pull about the kinds of systems that and sort of cultural references and codes that he uses, the mathematics, the architecture that goes into his work. That is, to me, after reflecting on it for a long time, I feel like it's a kind of a, it pulls you into an orbit. There's a desire to understand the symmetries, the relationships, and then there's, as you referred to, there's the intensity of the way he builds the thing. There's the facture of the paint, the thick paint, the dazzling color, and there's this kind. I after years of looking at it, I think after a long time of sort of spending time with this, I realized it's the kind of orbit between these things. It's an ongoing process. There's not ultimately, I never arrive at a solution of now I understand it and it's a closed situation, but being pulled into that orbit and existing within that, I think for me finally becomes what the work is about. There's a painting of his that's not in this exhibition called The Doric Order, which is in Pittsburgh at the Carnegie Museum. And I spent a period of time there at one point just studying it for several days and making a small copy of it and so on. So it's a deep experience, and there's never a conclusion. So it's that relationship to the work that was so compelling to me, and that I think in very different ways is common to the artists that we selected for the exhibition.
Yeah, I guess I'd say the exact same thing, except I didn't discover him in Mississippi. So, but everything else would be the same, I guess. I mean, kind of talked about Jensen a lot. I first found his work when I was at Pratt, so back in the late 90s, and yeah, again, mostly through books. So kind of not, and even when you put up that first image, it was, it's difficult to get a sense of the scale and also the kind of physicality of the paint, in a book, but you can still, I was still fascinated by trying to, having some entry point maybe through bits of language or some data, and understanding that there was some kind of system at work that I could begin to kind of maybe decode and kind of engage the way with the painting, the way you would maybe do a close reading of a text, where you're really looking for almost like evidence, like a forensic reading of the work, where you're sort of trying to sort of decipher what's happening in the painting or in even his works on paper. And then reaching a certain point, like Ken said, where I sort of thought of it sort of comparable to almost like chess, which is something I also find has this kind of balance between a kind of mental processing and a kind of beauty formally and aesthetically. But in chess, where, you maybe would, the concept of being at a book, where you would know, if you're playing a chess game, you would know particular moves that you should follow in order to win, or the best move to play that is sort of already been transcribed into a book. But there could become a point in a game where you become out of book, where you no longer understand sort of what steps to take next. And then you reach this kind of point in his paintings and I think in games and puzzles and things as well, where it becomes more of an aesthetic experience or an optical experience, or become something that is sensory. And that's something I've always really loved about Jensen's work. And I think we talked about it for a long time, the idea, we had that shared interest. Also talked to Chris, I remember a long time ago about, I know Jensen, Chris has written a lot about Jensen, so has probably a lot to say as well, which would be really interesting to hear his point of view. But then saw, like sort of different manifestations of Jensen's work in a number of different artists and tried to bring them together for the show.
Yeah. Thank you for doing that. It's great that we get to see all of these works together. And so this is maybe a perfect entryway. Chris, would you like to share with us how you relate to Jensen's work and how it has been seminal for you?
Sure. Well, first I want to just say, thank you to Ken and John for doing this show. It's a really cool show and full of surprises and wonderful connections. So thanks for doing all the work to put this together and make the catalog. It's all lovely. Happy to be part of it. I guess I knew about Jensen, but really my pivotal encounter was a show at DIA when they were on 22nd Street. They had a big Alfred Jensen show, and there were all these huge paintings. And I was quite shocked at just the color and the intensity of the paintings physically up close. Then I was really interested, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out his logics, and I never could quite find things out. It seemed that the paintings were slightly twisted or changed in ways, or I'm just not smart enough to figure out how he put like a Mayan calendar plus physics or something together. But I think that for me personally, there was a moment when here were these great paintings and he seemed to be making them without a lot of aesthetic decisions. He seemed to be able to make radical decisions based on something that wasn't, I need more blue here, or I need more pink because it's going to be prettier or better. He seemed to be able to generate these amazing color machines without trying to make it pleasing. And so that fascinated me. That there was a way to make these such powerful work without trying to make something that was beautiful. And then because I wrote something in the Rail, we ended up meeting Regina Bogat, and I remember Fong and I were lucky enough to drive out to New Jersey and see his studio. And one of my fondest memories is being in the basement with Regina, and she's showing us these piles of papers, including Con Ed bills and scraps of paper that Alfred Jensen had been, doodling on and drawing on. And I remember we were looking at one, I turned it over and it had Mark Rothko's phone number on the back of a Con Ed bill. So for me, it was a very inspirational thing for me to really try to understand Alfred Jensen.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned Chris, since you mentioned Regina, I don't know if she or Anna are on this, but I want to thank them. Regina Bogat, great artist herself. I want to thank them for helping us to have that amazing painting in this show. So
yes,
much appreciation,
Regina, and she's a terrific painter.
Yeah, agreed. And thank you for that personal anecdote. Bruce, would you like to share with us how you came to Alfred Jensen's work? Or we can
Bruce might be muted.
There, better?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
I was very lucky to come across an old book of Jensen's. I believe it was Abrams. And I saw these amazing paintings that were unlike other paintings that I had seen at the time. And I was also incredibly lucky to come to New York at the time that the Dia show and I believe it was the Guggenheim shows were going on. That was when I first arrived, and it was such a revelation because it was work that I really wanted to understand, and kind of opened up a lot of ideas for me. The idea that you could incorporate other aspects of work, other, the Mayan calendar, the Chinese calendar, the time, the mathematics, this history could be embedded into a painting and have it be so dazzling. And also, of course, the opticality and the physicality has always been important to me. And yep, and that has not waned. I'm still totally fascinated by going and re-looking at a lot of the work. It just seems that the more embedded the image becomes, the more it doesn't answer things, but opens up incredible questions. And I love that in work.
Yeah, we can really see that, how that physicality has carried through to your work, Bruce, as
Thank
well.
you.
Yeah, I could quickly just add just what you mentioned, Bruce, sort of the title. We took the title of the show from the Jensen painting, but it was that idea that, there's a lot of information, and maybe leads to a certain point, but it doesn't answer a question for you. It doesn't solve any question for you, but it leaves you in a place that is sort of opens up more questions and sort of has you experience something that is sort of specific in its own right. Yeah.
Totally.
And so perhaps this is a question to all of you, perhaps the curators more specifically, but what could you say are some of the common threads that unite some of the work chosen and seen in this show, that have Alfred Jensen's work as kind of the starting point?
I'd be curious to hear others, but I'm also happy to jump in at any point.
I could say a little bit about that, but I'd be interested what other people would say too. In every case, I think every work in the show is arguably abstract. There's a lot of work, a lot of painting that's going on, particularly these days, that's very representational in many senses, but all of this work is really abstract work. And yet it's work that contains and channels and works with things of the world. It works with information. It works with, it's not a thing about purity or being isolated off. In fact, it's like rather impure, most of it. It contains things and brings things in and pulls things in from the world and combines them sometimes in surprising ways, and is abstract at the same time. So I think that's a common thread, and I wouldn't want to overgeneralize, because even within that there's a range. There's a real range in many ways among the different works, and yet I feel like there's some continuity on that level.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I do think they're essentially abstract, but it seems like, again, not to generalize too much, but they're grounded in some form of reality. Like an attempt to kind of either decipher reality through language or to translate it through number systems or kind of counting or mathematics. But also, like with Chris's works, there's collaged objects, so they become, maybe they're like symbols or the actual materials of the world. And I know Leslie Roberts talks about her work. She's sort of like almost like a still life artist, where she's using all the material that's around her, readily available, but the language of that's from all different places. So it's interesting that that information, or the sort of evidence of a kind of reality, gets sort of translated into the works, and then results in a sort of abstraction in general that still has elements of those initial origins of the work, maybe snippets of language or calculations, or again, like with Chris's, maybe the material, but becomes something kind of new in itself and becomes this abstract piece.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it, that there's this balance between the reality and the perhaps transformation into abstraction. At least, I mean, perhaps not a thread throughout all of the work, but it does seem that in the work of Charles Gaines, Ellen Lesperance, Leslie Roberts, which you just mentioned, Zyler Jane, and Bruce Pearson, that there is this attention to the grid, or some kind of system or rule that is followed that we just spoke about with Jensen. And so in following this rule, does one arrive at a certain kind of image? Can you speak to maybe some of those works and how that plays in? Or Bruce, would you like to speak about your process?
Maybe, are you muted, Bruce? I'm not sure. I can't.
Oh,
there you go. Oh,
I didn't realize it was,
we were calling on you. Yeah.
I didn't know that. Could you repeat the question very quickly again?
Sure. What I was trying to get at is that there is kind of an underlying structure to the grid, or to following a system or a rule that one might create for oneself or then deviate from.
Yes.
I was mentioning certain artists whose work we see here, like Charles Gaines that we're seeing right here, or Ellen Lesperance, and your work kind of has some of that underlying system that you're following. So perhaps you could let us in a little bit into your process as it relates to that.
Well, this painting in particular is a grid painting, and I've been working with a series of grids. But basically, with all of my work, I try to set up systems that then I can either break or that will generate non-subjective choices. So the Eulipians have been incredibly important to me, and they were a group of writers that would create these constraints in order to deal with non-subjective systems that would create something that was different than we're used to experiencing. So, and I feel that a lot of the artists in the show are kind of setting up these systems, and then they're figuring out ways to subvert their own system, so that you go, oh, I think I got it. And then when you look towards that, it slips and it remains open. And that's, what I'm loving in the show, is that so much of the work, even though it seems rule-based, it's not following the rules that are being set up are open, so that they're not set in a rule, if that makes sense.
I wonder if could we go to Bruce's work real quick? Sure.
Yeah.
So with this, I used a text, and then I gridded it, and something that might not be so obvious to begin with is that there's maybe 50 to 70 different whites. But when you first look at it, it looks like it's a white. But I also did a companion piece that was all based with color, the same painting, but with kind of an Albers-like color system. And reading about Jensen and all of his use of color is fascinating to me, because Albers, Goethe, and Itten all create a different system with dealing with the color. And then also, I at one point in my life, I was studying color that was used around the world. So in whites in Asia or in China are often considered death, whereas in the West, in Europe, it's considered purity. So I like playing with these kind of contradictions, and I'm fascinated by contradiction, because I find binaries to be so restrictive.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry.
Of course.
How do you choose the text you use? I'm curious, like, if is it something in particular about, like, I know a lot of your work well. I don't know if I ever
Yes.
really do that, but just curious, yeah, how you arrive at the piece, the work, the text you want to use.
Well, basically, it's all fan language. So things that I'm reading, or I also, my wife is a poet, and therefore I go to a number of readings and am friends with a lot of poets now. But there's something that poets do that I'm fascinated with in their use of language. Mine isn't as sophisticated. I just, there's something of resonance that occurs, or I'll do a painting that contradicts the language. And then it's kind of setting up these systems that then come together, but they don't come together. And then I'm hoping that then it's generating different ideas each time that you experience the work.
So this isn't autobiographical, Bruce. You haven't always dreamed of growing up to become a princess?
I think it's a little autobiographical for all of us.
Oh,
At
great.
some point in our life.
Good to know.
I mean, who hasn't dreamed of growing up to become a princess at some point?
I can identify.
It's a hopeful message.
It is a hopeful message.
And so I love that the text here is, you really have to look to be able to decipher what it is, and that you're creating these crevices for us to wander in as we figure out the lettering. And John, I think your work also has a very intense wording and lettering and kind of accumulation of information. Would you like to speak a bit more about how you're using all of this information?
I planned to talk about other things, but forgot to remember what my own work was about. I think actually it's not that far from the truth. I kind of sometimes it's difficult to like reconstruct or remember exactly what went into the making of something. But yeah, I guess so this is drawn, so it's very different than Bruce's in that it's pretty flat generally, and there's a little paint in it, but not a lot. And again, large. So yeah, it's time consuming and labor intensive, but I think that's in a number of the works that feel like they incrementally kind of build over time, and then there's a transformation that happens through that process of kind of counting or building. Yeah, I had a general idea to work with sort of like recurrence in social class, and then I had this sort of vision of the diagram of the Earth sort of split in half from the crust to the core, and sort of superimposed. I guess that was sort of a relationship to Jensen, although this is, Jensen did it in such a different way, but like that sort of synthesizing sort of different structures or information onto each other is something I really took away from his work and been really fascinated by. So you can kind of decipher the, if you were to move, it moves from the sort of exterior, which is sort of like, I think it's each state birth rates I color coded and then paired them up, and then each sort of phase of this process leads to more specificity. So kind of moves from those state statistics as if sort of where you're born indicates kind of where you'll begin to kind of enter into this sort of cycle. And then it moves into sort of professions that are most prevalent, either the highest paying or the lowest paying in those particular states. There's insurance companies that are most prominent there, where those insurance companies are located, the largest corporations in those states. And then it moves into individuals. So then within that, I generated a zip code, which then led to, I looked for the most famous person to live. And that's sort of like most famous person to live in that zip code. And that's kind of like those little gray areas in the center are like their silhouettes, more or less. And then right after that is how they died, or if they're still alive. And then moving into the center, which I thought of like the core, is sort of the principle that guides it. And it's this sort of mathematical principle of recurrence, where like in chaos theory, where a system will sort of return to itself and cross its own path at a certain point. So I thought there was an interesting kind of move or something, there's sort of, maybe something greater forces at work that dictate how sort of human behavior is either very specific or kind of has these broad general sort of ways of being structured, as if sort of, this idea of emergence combined with how like an ant colony that sort of forms, and then how an individual behaves within that individual system. So not comparing us to ants, but still just that's generally the idea. But yeah, so I didn't have a total plan in terms of how I'd make it. It just sort of started and then eventually worked my way towards the center. And then the idea became clear as it went. So.
Right.
I'd like to throw in a comment on John's work also.
Criticism or? No,
yeah,
sorry.
It could be a criticism.
That's fine.
I think it speaks to the complexity and the density of John's work, and this work in particular, and that there's patterning, there's abstraction, but this is actually, I thought of this seeing the show hung once the show was all together. John's piece is the only one that, in addition to that complexity of pattern and system and thought, also includes something which is like a staple really of the history of painting and drawing, but doesn't occur in any other piece in the whole show, I don't think, which is illusionism. There's like an illusion of depth with shading that occurs in John's work, as well as this intense abstraction. And it's the only instance of that of any work in the whole show. Elsewhere, everything is entirely without that illusionism. It's not the dominant thing, but it's there.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good point. But also, I think there is a kind of common thread where numbers and letters really start to take prominence in a lot of these works, whether it's through research or in hiding, like in this one, or in George Widener, where he's really obsessive with the calendar, the Western calendar, with the months being stamped and these large numbers that are dates and take up the large portion of the work. And in Zyler Janes, we also see a kind of collection of number palindromes that together stacked become this pyramid, and makes reference to ancient civilizations, whether it's Egyptian pyramids or the temples of the Aztecs. And so numbers take a prominent place, whether it's to relate us to something that's harmonious about mathematics, or that stirs some kind of awe. And well, Chris, we just saw your work, and the numbers take on the main form or attention or image in that one painting. Do you want to share with us a little bit about how you're using numbers and how you're seeing that relationship?
Well, I remember I almost flunked out of high school because I could not do math. So my relationship to numbers is very primitive. When I was first in New York, I did I did a job where I was working all night. And this was in the 70s, and the streets were dangerous at night. And I had a thing where I would take a nickel and 2 pennies, and I had to have 7 was my lucky number. And I always had to have 7 cents when I went out to do this job. And I can remember being like, halfway down the stairs going, no, I got to go get the 7 cents. And, I never got mugged or stabbed. And I remember, so that's my relationship to numbers. It's kind of superstitious, and certain numbers have obsessed me, but I can't say that I understand much about systems in number. This painting there, I realized that the painting did not have numbers, and a few years later, I went back and added the numbers, and I realized when I would look at my paintings, I would count the number of dots, and I would say, oh, there's this many dots, and sometimes I think, well, that's not a lucky number, I'll add a dot, or I'll take one away. And so at a certain point, I started writing the numbers into these dots because I realized that's what I was doing when I was looking at the painting. I mean, saying this out loud, the whole thing is quite absurd. And so for me to approach this kind of systematic thought was kind of a helpless, slightly absurd feeling. And I still have, lucky numbers. 13 is a lucky number. Used to be 7. Now I'm more interested in 6, but I can't tell you that this is anything other than some kind of intuitive desire for magic or control, perhaps. I mean, I think it's interesting that in a show curated to talk about using systems, the works all look quite different. And I can tell one of John's paintings a block away. Mike Cloud's painting has a terrific painting in the show. It's a Mike Cloud. So it's interesting that we can all be interested in using systems and end up with very personal, different paintings. I was lucky enough to know Melvin Way briefly. I was working as an art therapist on the Lower East Side, and met him around there. And I think I curated him into a show at one point, but it was interesting to talk to him. He was someone who was living with schizophrenia. And when he was on meds, he was very kind of together in different way. But so he was clearly, had a different brain than I have. But at the same time, it was fascinating to talk to him about his fascination with formulas, his sense of, chemical formulas and physics and the magic that kind of mathematics had for him. And the energy that's in these little Melvin Ways, that's a great one in the show, is just fascinating. And I think that being around him, I felt, well, I have a similar fascination with numbers, but I think he had a lot more comprehension than I did. Is that helpful?
Yeah, no, I love
It
that
is.
you're mentioning Melvin Way. I mean, that's such a great grouping of his works, and they're so incredibly central for what they are of, which is these chemical formulas. And when John and I were looking at them, we were wondering, are these real formulas of things, that a chemist would understand? And what's kind of amazing is that we were able to determine that some of them are roots of things like LSD and morphine and probably drugs that he may have been using or thinking about. But then they took on this imaginative form. Like he basically just started elaborating on this notation and creating his own chemicals.
Absolutely. He was involved in chemicals. But, he would reach into a pocket in his overcoat and he would pull out a bunch of these things, like, he was working on them all the time. And just a great, great artist.
Yeah.
Which brings me, go ahead, Ken.
I was just agreeing with what Chris said. That's all.
Could I say one quick thing about it? Just about that, how he pulled them out of his pocket. I mean, they're the smallest works in the show, but they're so incredibly intense. And the fact that he had them with him, and I never met him. I wish. It's a really great story, Chris, but that he was using them as like carrying them with him and continuously working on them. The paper itself, even if you were just to sort of not have any marks on it, becomes this real record of this passage through time, and it becomes this real physical evidence of that process, that's why, I mean, yeah, the scale shift in the show was something we were thinking a lot about too, moving from the Melvin Ways into the Mike Cloud, like you said, or to the 18-foot Jensen painting, but having both be equally sort of intense,
Yeah, the intensity of those at their tiny, tiny scale is amazing. Along those lines, also the putting together, seeing the Xyler Janes next to the Jensen is a really incredible contrast in that way too, because there's something in common about the color deposited on the grid, but with Alfred Jensen's work, that intensity of that heavy impasto, and then with Xyler, just the exquisiteness of her touch as she places these little points of color, and those two things next to each other is incredible to see.
Yeah. And I
mean-
think, yeah, sorry, I'm talking too much here, but I'm, yeah, excited as well. That, to your point, Chris, too, about numbers and me thinking about Zyler Jane's work, you know, that, I mean, to me, it totally makes sense to see, and in the show, we sort of saw artists using number systems or mathematics totally differently. And I know from even in my family playing lottery, you know, our family played lottery all the time and had particular numbers that were birthdays that we all felt were like ours. You know, they had some sort of like significance to them. So they were specific maybe and personal, but at the same time, and I think Zyler Jane has that relationship to particular numbers, number systems, and like you were describing this work with the nested prime palindromes, sort of repetition of numbers, but also fused with very personal like color choices, you know, tied into other systems like the weather, you know, ways to sort of fuse or kind of reveal something that's exciting about sort of number systems or mathematical structures that we don't really really see. And I think what you had mentioned, Bruce, about sort of language and sort of like poetry sort of being comprised of words put together in a particular way. I see Zyler Jane's, and then yours, Chris, and a number of the artists, Jensen's as well, sort of creating a kind of that transformation of putting numbers together becomes something that we're sort of used to in language, but we don't often see sort of through mathematical systems. And I think that's sort of one thing that ties the sort of letters and numbers and words and that kind of, you know, sort of source material together for me.
Right. And I feel like there's also something about the repetition that can either amplify or lose the meaning. And we kind of see that in Mel Bachner's work with words that we can actually read and know what they mean to us. The several ways to say thank you or money, and how seeing that it's kind of mocking us in some ways also in the scale of it. I believe you two were able to speak with him and that he knew Jensen. Is there something that you can share with us in regards to that conversation?
Well, it was great to just have the chance to talk with Mel. I had not met him before we were trying to put together this show, and yeah, he showed actually he was in a two-person thing years ago with Jensen that was, I think, homage to Pythagoras, so it connected also with that piece that we have in the show. And he wrote about Jensen, and this is like decades ago. He was someone who was very interested in Jensen. And, you know, we were just really happy to be able to connect with him and get his work, have these particular works in the show, which he hasn't shown before. The humor, the irony, you know, what he does with language and paint together to give this feeling is incredible. And you know, in particular, the thing with this sort of humor, I think kind of Becky Brown connects with that a little bit too, with her "How do you like my poem?" painting. There's something of that kind of feel of language. So yeah, I don't know, John, if you wanted to say anything about
Oh yeah,
Mel.
we were really excited to meet him, and I think he did tell a story about having met Jensen and been in his studio, and I thought he had talked about maybe the actual Pythagorean theorem painting that he had, because he told us it was in panels or sections, that maybe it was a similar painting, but
Well,
he seemed very excited, and he was really interested. What I appreciated was like interested in getting his work and showing it in a context with other artists, younger artists, and yeah, that was really great.
Yeah, he seemed excited to do it and interested in all the work in the show, the other artists as well. Since you mentioned the Jensen being in panels, the Pythagorean theorem, there's a thing about that painting that I've been kind of wanting to say, and it's maybe, I don't know, it's coming out of context here a little bit, but we were talking about grids earlier. And I had not seen the painting before we got it for the show in person. And when we saw it, I realized something that blew my mind. And I think it really speaks to this thing that we were discussing about grids and systems and mental versus physical. The way it's painted on 4 panels, and the way the pattern that he painted, which is based on basically kind of a checkerboard pattern, interacts with the edges of those panels blows me away. It's amazing. because he doesn't make it line up with the edges of the panels, and the way it breaks and it cracks into the forms that he, or the forms that he makes or don't correspond to the breaks in the panels, is there's something so odd about that and also beautiful to me. And you can see it, I think, in this shot. You can see it better when you're there, but I didn't realize it until I saw the piece in person. There's something about that that speaks to him.
He never saw these paintings in his studio together. When we visited his studio with Fong, it was quite a small studio. It's on the top of this house, little house in Bloomville.
Glen Ridge.
Whatever it is.
It's in Glen Ridge.
Yeah, Glen, New Jersey, nowhere New Jersey. And
the town next to where I live.
Oh, cool. But anyway, the studio was quite small. And I was asking Regina, how do you make these giant paintings? And so one of these panels would fit down the staircase. And so he would make the panels, but he wouldn't see them together as a painting until they were out in a gallery or a museum somewhere. So it's wild to think that inspired me as well, that you could make these huge things in a small space.
That space that he made these in, the studio, top floor of that house in Glen Ridge, it belonged to like a 19th century landscape painter before they moved there. And there was a slot in the floor of that top floor studio where he could drop paintings down, or the panels.
That's how he got them down.
To get them out.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So going back to perhaps something that Bruce brought up earlier was that there are these rules, but then the rules are subverted in some form, and a transformation takes place. How much do you think that knowing about the original source, whether it's a formula or a mathematical formula, and what actually we see here is important? You know, in the way, Chris, you were also talking about the numbers being superstition, or some of the letters just being suddenly their meaning has been lost. You know, what is that balance that we're seeing here in all of the works in the show?
Well, you look at this giant painting, it's to me, it's very psychedelic. It's an amazing experience to just spend time with the painting and just gaze and watch these things flicker and move and jump and just take in all the color. It's a fabulous experience. And to try to nail down the system, I mean, you know, I grew up in a house of kind of classical musician people. And so I could be moved by something, but I wouldn't know if it was like F sharp and it was, you know, I wouldn't know the structure of the music that my mother could talk about, but I could be moved by it. So I feel on one level, one can be transported by these paintings, and you don't have to worry about the, you know, locating the real thought process behind it. And I think for all of us, the first experience of Jensen is like, wow. And as you are obsessed with the work, then you spend time trying to figure out, you know, the history and some of the theories and the structure of thought behind it. But the paintings, I never get tired of these paintings. So, yeah.
I'm with Chris on that too. And I don't know, I come back to the paintings, and that's something about Jensen that come back to him over time and continually revisit them in different forms. Like, again, never seeing it in person is one thing. Finally getting to see it in the show is like totally different. And then, but then looking at the painting, following up, I mean, he's sort of one of the artists that I would come back to whenever I feel like I need sort of like inspiration or just sort of want to kind of find layers in the work. So I really, but I think maybe some of the other works in the show, I'm curious what Bruce and Ken think as well, could work in a different way, where you sort of begin by entering with sort of bits of information, and then there's that kind of moment like Chris described of being like really wowed by the visuals. I don't know what you both think about that.
I would like to say something, because when Chris was speaking, I'm just looking at a small image of everyone off the screen compared to the large image of the work. And I was seeing all of Chris's books in the background. And I was looking at the painting and I was looking at the books. And I was thinking that these paintings are kind of like a library. And it was if you stretched it, it was an odd kind of mirror. And then with my understanding of his work, he had such deep knowledge, and like a library, you can get very, very involved in it. And also, like a library, I think every time you come back to it, it's a different experience.
One thing that I might say is that, you asked this question about how important is it to know or to have some access to like information that is a constituent part of something or that's behind something. And there is some address to that in a kind of a direct way in Stephanie Jemison's work, in the sense that the source of the marking in her works, I don't know if that could be, if maybe one of her pieces could be pulled up, but the source of her marking is James Hampton was an artist who, it was a so-called outsider artist, was working really by himself. He made this amazing thing called, there's an Ellen Lesprince. Do you have a Stephanie Jemison? Can we pull her up? He was working on his own. He made this incredible installation called The Throne of the Third Heaven, which is the National Gallery of Art now owns it, I think. And he had extensive notation to himself that was written in a private language. I mean, literally a private language just for himself. And she's working with marks from that text. And then she's working with transparency and opacity. And I think there's, in some way there's she's directly addressing this question of is it accessible? What is accessible? What is not accessible? And it's beautiful, and it has a different feeling from a lot of the work. This sort of transparency and immanence is stands kind of at the other end of the spectrum from these things that are, let's say the heaviness of paint or the heaviness of objects. She's sort of like working in a different register on that. But I think it's quite relevant to that question of like access. How do we have access to something? What do we have access to? How do we know?
Yeah.
So there she's working on transparent sheets that are draped across, and they're quite vulnerable, really, too, which I think goes with that in an interesting way.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And so going back to, creating more relationships between the works in the show, do you think that these, what kind of traditions do you think that these works bear traditions with object making or drawing or painting or other visual sources? What is this kind of work a part of in terms of its history that came before it, aside from Jensen?
You're talking about what the thesis of the whole show? How is that part of this longer?
Yeah, I'm asking what is kind of the histories that these works are a part of?
Well, I think it's an endless history. I mean, just off the bat, I can think of so many of our contemporaries that could be in this show. I was thinking of someone like Lauren Monk, who's devoted his life to these incredible paintings of art world and biographies, or thinking about music, thinking about Harry Smith, sitting in jazz clubs and making weird notations of musical structures. I mean, when I was first in Peru, I was obsessed with the carpets and the fabric work. And then I realized that a lot of the things that I thought were just, formal decisions were actually, it was a narrative about this meant rain, this meant mountain range, this meant human beings. So I didn't know that at first. But I think this tradition goes back to the earliest weavings, carpets, whatever, and goes forward.
Also writing.
Mhm.
Writing.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said weavings, because that idea, the grid is something that's associated. We think of it maybe as like kind of an intellectual thing or a mathematical thing or a conceptual thing, but it's also something that's part of making things and has been, as long as people have been making things, and woven cloth or things that are put together, things that are, just physical assemblage of things. And that's clearly, in Ellen Lesperance's work, she's making the connection to that with the woven clothing and so on. But with Jensen as well, I mean, there's a way in which the sort of checkerboard patterns that he uses to build his paintings has to do with maybe textiles that he saw, as a child in Guatemala,
Right.
and that's an ancient way of making things, and not necessarily mathematical, but physical, really.
Yeah, I sort of think all those things, also so many forms of abstraction, since we sort of started by talking about, the works as essentially abstract. And I had been reading about Charles Gaines's work. I know, Amanda, we were talking about it yesterday a bit. And he talked about really being influenced by like tantric paintings and drawings, sort of finding ways to connect us sort of through a system to a greater sort of like force at work. There's a lot of other layers to what he does, but I thought that was interesting, sort of as an influence as well, that I hadn't really thought of or seen in these prints. So yeah.
And I mean, if you want to talk about, modern art traditions, conceptual art, certainly for,
Totally, yeah.
for someone like Charles Gaines.
Mhm.
Yeah.
When I was also looking at a lot of the work in the show and actually reading about the artists, I was also thinking about this idea of graphic notation, because there was such musicality in a lot of this work.
Mhm.
And yeah, so many incredible composers have worked with graphic notation.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a back and forth also with a lot of artists.
Yeah, the Dorinda Voigt is a good example. I think of that, even though it's not, I think hers is, well, was it based on a weather system, I believe, or
No, the Dorinda Voigt is based on a musical composition.
musical, that's what it is. So yeah, it
yes,
is.
yes.
So I don't know if you could possibly jump to that real quick, but I think that's perfect connection to what Bruce said. Dorinda Voigt. Yeah, that one right there. So.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
Beethoven piece.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for this great discussion, and for the two curators for putting together the show that we currently have at the Pratt Manhattan Gallery. I think that I would love to continue the conversation more about how all of this work is this balance between the cerebral and the sensual, and how all of these works kind of come together in this way. But I think that we can maybe conclude the discussion and take some questions from the audience. We would love to hear what the audience has to say. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for this incredibly generous and lovely dialogue today. It's been a pleasure to listen to. We have several audience questions. So the first I'm going to ask on behalf of Paul. Paul's question is, fascination and comprehension with regard to formulas are very interesting terms to bring into the discussion, as the thesis of the exhibition seems to be about opening a space for the viewer to exist somewhere between those two mental states, a space in which a viewer is solving puzzles or looking at puzzles that may or may not have a solution, like rules, but playful rules. Is playfulness something of importance to you all as artists?
I would say yes. Since you gave me a yes or no there, I'll say yes.
I'll say yes. I mean, I think for me, when I encountered Alfred Jensen, it was this very inspiring thing, and it was really about freedom. It's funny to say you relate to someone who is so systematic in his approach, and yet what I got from it was that you could follow your obsessions. There's a wonderful story I don't know whether I read this or Regina told us this, that Rothko and Al Jensen were good friends, and Rothko's doing a studio visit, and Al shows him these abstract expressionist paintings, kind of more generic paintings, and on the wall around them, he has all these obsessive graphs and illustrations of Goethe's color theory. And the story is that Rothko, in the middle of the visit, turns and says, you know, Al, this is your real work. Your crazy obsessions with color and Pythagorean theories and calendars, you should do this. This is your work. And, you know, the rest is history. He did that. But so for me, that whole story is about the freedom to follow your love, your obsessions, your play. This was his play. And he was trying to make serious paintings, and Rothko went, go with your wonderful play. So I don't know if that answers that question, but
I'd like to pick up on what Chris said, because when I was going and looking at the other artists in the show, something that really stood out to me was it seemed that no one was afraid to put any kind of constraints on themselves. They had a freedom, and especially Jensen. And also there is a playfulness, but it's often a serious play, what the Zen community often calls serious play.
Thank you all so much for those answers. And thank you for that question, Paul. The next question is going to be from Cal M Studio. Cal, I'll give you the chance to unmute. Are you able to unmute? Okay, I'll ask the question on Cal M Studios' behalf. The question is, why do you think that Jensen hasn't received the kind of attention that other painters from the Abex period have?
Chris wants to take that one.
I don't want to take that one. I mean,
I'm biting my tongue on my answer. So.
The art world is a mysterious place, and there are so many tremendous artists who do their work and get whatever they have, you know. Obviously, for all of us, he deserves a lot more attention than he gets, but who can, I don't know.
The other nice thing, the other nice thing about art and is that things keep changing. So we're seeing that right now. That so many artists that were really amazing artists that were not given much attention in the early part of their career are now given the attention, like the great Joan Jonas shows that are up right now at MoMA and the Drawing Center. Astonishing shows, but I don't think until recently she's been getting the attention that she deserved. And I think that there's many artists right now that are kind of being rediscovered or are appreciated maybe for the first time. So it keeps moving, luckily. It's not fixed.
Thank you for those answers. We have two more questions, one from Chris and one from Fong. Chris's question is there anything about the shape of numbers, letters, or symbols that carries meaning for any of you? Or even a synesthetic quality, like 3s and C's are always red?
That's an interesting question.
You mean for each of us individually? Is that what you
Yeah,
mean?
individually in your practices.
I mean, Chris talked about that a little bit in his work, 7, right? I'm always turning it back on you, Chris, to answer everything. But I don't know. I've had like, yeah, ever since I was a kid, I had a favorite number 4. I don't know if that still sort of carries through, but I don't know, probably common for everyone. I mean, I did sort of always believe that there was something personal about numbers. When I first got like my first ever computer, I made a computer program that predicted lottery numbers. I thought they'd be winning lottery numbers because I made it. Never won the lottery, unfortunately. Yeah, and I actually, yeah, it's interesting because I lived in where I used to have my first studio in Queens. There was my landlord lived in the basement, and I was on the second floor in a bedroom making a drawing about winning lottery numbers, and he was in the basement filling these pages of graph paper with numbers. And every time I went down to pay the rent, I would ask him, "What is all this? What are all these numbers?" And he used to tell me just to mind my own business. Never don't ask so many questions. Finally, I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm trying to predict the winning lottery numbers." I said, I'm upstairs 2 floors, like doing a whole drawing about this. And yeah, and he is spending years doing it. And then I said, "What do you do with these when you're done?" He said, "I just throw them out. I don't even play. I just want to know if I can figure it out." And so I collected them all. I still have them, and I just sort of started color coding them. So I don't know if that's not really getting at your question exactly, Chris, but there's different relationships, and I think, I don't know, I guess, and to tie back to the show, a lot of the work, has numbers sort of carry different types of importance in relationships in the way sort of they're used. And I think that's something that's always been fascinating for me.
I should mention at this point, George Widener's Magic Squares. It's a grid of numbers, and the magical quality is that if the numbers are added together in any row, any column, or any diagonal, the final number that you end up with is the same.
Yeah.
And that same square, the same number pattern, also appears in a Dürer print, a very old Dürer print.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting, like in terms of mathematics too, whether there's got a question of whether mathematics exists already and we just discover it, or if it's something that we're inventing, kind of like you'd invent anything. So I think that question is sort of central to the show as well for me, whether there's something that's already there that we're just tapping into through the artwork, or whether we're giving form to something and then using it to sort of describe the world. Again, not really your question, Chris, but sort of made me think of it when you mentioned Widener's piece too, Ken.
Thank you so much for those answers. And thank you for that question, Chris. The last question today is going to be from Fong. Fong, I'll give you the mic here.
Thank you, you guys, for coming and talking. Very simple question. How come the 2 curators, John and Ken, have failed to include the great Lauren Monk in the show? Is there a specific reason not to include Lauren Monk?
Ken's fault. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Sorry, Lauren.
Is Lauren Monk there in the room with you?
I know. Just being, curious a bit.
Lauren is truly great. I'll say that much.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Hi, Lauren. You're with us in spirit, or you were in the show. So many people could have been in this show.
He told me he liked it. He told me he. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Bruce.
Is it true that this is only part 1?
There's a rumor to that effect.
That's right, Bruce. That's part 1.
So I just want to make a quick shout out to Leslie Roberts, who's my neighbor here in Williamsburg, who's a wonderful artist, and I live with a little piece of hers, and I love living with that drawing. I love it. Thank you, Leslie.
Hi, Leslie.
Yes, it is. Yes. Yeah, the Alfred Jensen review that Chris wrote, I think it must have been in 2001, that Lynn Cook curated at Yeah, exactly. And I just want to share this one small instant, and we need to go, right, Kyle? I came back the second time. The first time was with Chris. Second time alone, and seeing Jasper Johns looking one of the paintings. And then I went up to lunch with Regina Bogart, Alfred's widow. Came back after an hour and a half. He's still there in the same painting, same spot.
Wow.
So just put it there. The great restrained romantic, namely Jasper John, have discovered a kindred spirit in someone else who had that a little bit more overt in his systematic way of framing his own work. But that's just a nice, you know, I brought it up to Jasper not long ago. And he say he doesn't remember. I doubt it. Thank you, you guys. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks, Fawn.
Thank you, Fong.
Chris, Bruce. Congratulations.
Thank you,
And please
everyone.
come and see the show and keep Lauren Monk in mind the next
Definitely.
time. Ciao.
See
Thank you
Now-
so much for that last question, Fong. And thank you all so much again for this conversation, which has been such a pleasure to listen to. And thank you to everyone in the audience for your questions. Thank you as well to the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our growing archive, which is available on YouTube and where this video will be shortly. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our writers and our operations and our staff. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at a special time of 11 a.m., join us for a conversation on the work of the Monira Foundation, featuring Isabel Pignol-Blasi, Lydia Costa, Ann Munkes, Carlene Moeller, and Monira residents Kevin Quiles Bonilla, Paul Morton, and Rashad Wright. And it will all be hosted by Ginevra de Blasio. And with now, as is Rail tradition, I'm going to give you the chance to turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for being here today, and take care, everybody.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everyone. Thank
everyone.
you, Fong.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Everybody.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks,
Tuesday.
John.
Thank you, Amanda, for your
Wednesday.
questions.
Hey, Elena.
There's Lauren.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
I am going to get over to see the show tomorrow. I'm going to go see.
All right,
Thank you, you
Lauren.
guys. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.